Civil War, a brutal and defining conflict that split the United States in two. It lasted from 1861 to 1865, resulting in over 600,000 deaths and leaving the nation torn apart. The Union, with its massive population, industrial strength, and resources, eventually defeated the Confederacy, keeping the country united. But what if, in an alternate timeline, the South had won? How would the world look today? Could the Confederacy have maintained independence? Let's dive into what could have happened. The initial conditions. To start, it's important to understand why the South fought the Civil War in the first place. The Confederacy, made up of southern states, wanted to preserve their way of life, which was heavily dependent on slavery. They felt that the federal government, especially under President Abraham Lincoln, was infringing on their rights. The North, on the other hand, wanted to abolish slavery and preserve the Union. Despite the North's clear advantage in terms of resources, manpower, and industry, the South had a significant strategic advantage early in the war. They had strong military leadership, including Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, and they were fighting on familiar territory. So, what if the South had managed to win? The role of foreign intervention. One of the biggest factors in the South's victory could have been foreign intervention. The South was hoping that European powers, particularly Britain and France, would intervene on their behalf, recognizing their independence in exchange for cotton. The Union tried to block Southern cotton from reaching Europe, but Britain still relied heavily on it for its textile industry. In this alternate timeline, let's assume that Britain and France, driven by their economic needs, decided to formally recognize the Confederacy. This would have given the South a huge boost, not only in terms of military support, but also in terms of trade and legitimacy. With European powers backing them, the Confederacy would have had the resources to push the Union to the negotiating table. Peace negotiations and secession. If the South had secured foreign recognition and continued to hold ground, the Union might have eventually realized that a prolonged war wasn't worth the cost. War weariness would have set in, especially as casualties mounted. Union General George McClellan, a known advocate for peace with the South, even ran for president on a platform of negotiating with the Confederacy. In this alternate history, McClellan could have won the election and pushed for peace talks. These negotiations could have led to an official ceasefire and a treaty recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation. The South would have achieved its goal of secession, and the Union would have had to deal with a divided nation. It's important to note that even with a victory, the South would still face serious challenges in terms of infrastructure, economy, and governance. The Union, despite losing the war, would have remained a strong power and could have continued to be a major rival to the Confederacy. The future of slavery in the South. Now, let's tackle one of the most significant aspects of a Confederate victory: slavery. Slavery was the core of the Southern economy and society, but it was also facing growing opposition both within the U.S. and internationally. In this alternate timeline, how long could the Confederacy have kept slavery intact? If the Confederacy had achieved its independence, slavery would have remained legal, as it was protected by the Confederate Constitution. However, as abolition movements gained traction in Europe and the northern states, international pressure would likely have forced the Confederacy to reconsider slavery. In our timeline, Britain had already abolished slavery in its empire, and European countries were increasingly aligning with abolitionist ideals. Additionally, the South's reliance on slavery as an economic system would eventually prove problematic. Over time, as other nations industrialized, the Southern economy could have found itself at a disadvantage. The Confederacy would have faced increasing pressure to end slavery as its economic system became less sustainable. Even though slavery was vital to the South's economy, it would have eventually had to be abolished, not out of moral conviction, but out of economic necessity. The rise of industrialization and competition from other nations would have made the practice of slavery increasingly difficult to maintain. Social and political repercussions. The abolition of slavery, however, would not have been an easy process. The South would have faced intense internal resistance. The aristocratic plantation owners, who had built their wealth on slavery, would have fought hard to maintain the institution. Any efforts to end slavery could have sparked violent uprisings or even civil unrest within the South. Furthermore, even after slavery ended, the South would not have been quick to grant equal rights to African Americans. The large black population in the South, which made up nearly half the population in some states, would have faced continued segregation and oppression. A government like apartheid in South Africa could have emerged, with a system in place to ensure that black citizens were excluded from political and economic power. This would have led to a deeply divided society, with widespread inequality and racial tensions. Even if slavery was abolished, the societal structures that upheld white supremacy would have remained intact for many years, if not decades. The political landscape of America. Had the South won the war and established itself as an independent nation, the political landscape of America would be dramatically different. The Union, without the South, would have been smaller, weaker, and more isolated on the global stage. The government of the United States might have been forced to relocate its capital, potentially moving it to New York or Philadelphia, further away from Confederate territory. On the international front, the United States and the Confederacy would have remained bitter rivals. Trade relations between the two countries could have continued, but competition over territory and influence would have created ongoing tensions. Both nations would have been focused on expansion, particularly in the West and into Latin America. The South, for its part, would have likely sought to expand its influence into Mexico or Cuba, and could have even set up colonies in these areas. However, the South's focus on agriculture and slavery would have made it difficult for them to compete with the industrial powers of Europe. The end of American unity, perhaps one of the most profound impacts of a Confederate victory, would have been the end of the concept of American unity. The Civil War was a defining moment in American history, and the Union's victory helped solidify the idea of a united nation. But if the South had succeeded in its bid for independence, secession would have been seen as a legitimate option for other states as well. The idea of America as a unified nation would have been deeply shaken. The United States might have become more like a collection of loosely connected states, similar to the European Union, rather than the powerful, unified country we know today. Final thoughts. The South winning the Civil War would have dramatically changed the course of history. The Confederacy would have faced enormous challenges, from economic instability to racial conflict. The Union would have remained a strong power, but a divided one. The United States, as we know it, would never have come to exist. In this alternate timeline, the world would have looked very different. The South would have struggled to maintain its economy and social structure, while the Union would have dealt with the complexities of having to coexist with a hostile neighbor. The long-term effects of a divided America would have had ripple effects on global politics, trade, and society. What do you think the world would have been like had the South won the Civil War? Share your thoughts in the comments below.